The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the endless expanse of the wilderness. The air, crisp and biting with the chill of the encroaching night, whispered through the towering pines, their branches swaying like skeletal hands. In this remote part of the Montana forest, where few dared to venture, a haunting scene unfolded. A mustang, once proud and fierce, now stood tied to an old, gnarled tree in the heart of the woods. The horse's chestnut coat was matted, its ribs visibly protruding from its emaciated body. Its breathing was shallow and strained, a testament to the weakness that had overtaken it. Its eyes, once full of wild defiance, now stared blankly ahead, resigned to its cruel fate. The horse, named Blaze by its former owner, had been abandoned in this desolate place after suffering weeks of neglect. Tied to the tree with a rough rope, the creature was left alone, vulnerable to the elements and the predators that roamed the forest. The wolves could already be heard in the distance, their howls growing louder as the darkness crept closer. As the horse stood there, trembling, a man approached from the shadows of the forest. His name was Mason Collins, a grizzled, cold-hearted hunter in his late 30s, known for his lack of compassion. He had discovered the Mustang a week ago while tracking game, but now, seeing the animal in its weak state, he had no intention of saving it. With mounting debts and a life full of bitterness, Mason had decided that the horse was of no value to him. "You're nothing but a burden," Mason muttered under his breath, adjusting the rope to ensure it wouldn't slip. His voice was as cold as the wind that whipped through the trees. "A worthless creature. The wolves will take care of you soon enough." He took a step back, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the horizon. The wolves would soon arrive, and the Mustang would meet its end. Mason didn't flinch as he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving the horse alone in the wilderness. The last thing Mason heard as he disappeared into the forest was a faint whinny, weak and mournful, a sound not of desperation, but of acceptance. The Mustang knew it was alone. No one would come. As the shadows deepened and the air grew colder, the Mustang, Blaze, remained tethered to the tree, its body growing weaker with each passing minute. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant howls of wolves that circled, growing bolder with the fading light. Blaze's head hung low, its large eyes half closed, surrendering to the inevitable. The wolves were close, and it knew they would soon come for it. Its body, once strong and defiant, now ached with exhaustion and defeat. It could hear them now, footsteps, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the unmistakable growl of the pack. They were getting closer. Just as Blaze's legs buckled beneath it, a high-pitched whistle shattered the eerie silence. It was sharp, piercing, unlike any sound the horse had ever heard before. The wolves froze in their tracks, their eyes glowing with hunger as the whistle rang out once again. Blaze's ears flicked, momentarily distracted by the sound. The tension in the air thickened as a figure emerged from the trees, holding a flickering lantern that cast an eerie glow across the clearing. The wolves, confused but unwilling to leave their prey behind, snarled at the newcomer. The man who appeared was not like any other Blaze had seen. His face was weathered, his clothes ragged, and his eyes sharp with a hidden resolve. He had the look of someone who had lived alone in the wilderness for years, surviving through sheer will and experience. "Get back!" the man shouted, swinging the lantern in a wide arc. His voice was harsh, commanding, and full of authority. The wolves hesitated, their instincts urging them to retreat, sensing something in the stranger that made them wary. As the man stepped closer, the wolves growled, but one by one, they backed away, disappearing into the dark woods. The lantern's light illuminated the Mustang's trembling form, and the man's eyes softened. "Well, aren't you in a sorry state?" he muttered, eyeing the horse with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. He pulled a knife from his belt, his movements precise, and carefully approached the Mustang. Blaze's body tensed, but it didn't resist. There was no strength left to fight. The man began to cut the rope that bound Blaze to the tree, freeing it from its painful confinement. "You've got a lot of fight left in you, I can see that," the man said as he worked, his voice gentler now, a flicker of kindness in his tone. "But you'll need more than that to survive this place." With the last strand of rope cut, the Mustang collapsed to the ground, its legs too weak to support its own weight. The man crouched beside it, placing a hand gently on its neck. "Easy now," he whispered, his voice calm. "I'm not leaving you out here to die." The man stood, his wiry frame surprisingly strong as he fashioned a makeshift sled from branches. With great care he lifted the Mustang's fragile body onto the sled, the horse offering no resistance, its breathing shallow but steady. The man hitched the sled to his mule and, without a word, began the slow trek through the darkening forest toward his cabin, a secluded shelter deep within the woods. Blaze's tired eyes fluttered shut, and for the first time in days, the horse found itself no longer staring death in the face. It had been saved, but its journey was far from over. The wind howled through the trees as the man, whose name was Elias, trekked deeper into the forest, his mule trudging steadily through the snow-covered path. The air was biting, and every step seemed to echo through the wilderness. Blaze, once a proud Mustang roaming the plains, now lay motionless on the sled, too weak to stand on its own. Its ribs rose and fell in shallow breaths, each one a painful reminder of its struggle to survive. Elias's cabin was a small, weathered structure nestled in a clearing, its rough-hewn wooden walls blending with the surrounding forest. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, signaling the warmth and life inside, a stark contrast to the harsh world outside. As Elias reached the cabin, he unloaded Blaze from the sled with surprising ease, despite the animal's size and weight. Inside the cabin, Blaze was carefully laid on a bed of hay in the corner. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. The only sound, apart from the fire, was the faint rustle of the wind outside. Elias moved about the cabin with practiced efficiency, his hands steady despite his years of solitude. "Let's get you warmed up," Elias murmured to the Mustang, his voice soft yet firm. He walked over to the stove and began heating a pot of herbs, the mixture that had helped him survive for years in the wilderness. His hands, worn and calloused, worked quickly as he prepared a remedy to help Blaze recover. He returned to the horse's side, the steaming bowl in hand. Blaze's dark eyes flickered open briefly, meeting Elias's gaze. For the first time since its abandonment, there was a glimmer of recognition in the horse's eyes, a silent understanding that it had been rescued, not for any personal gain, but out of sheer kindness. Elias knelt beside Blaze, carefully tilting its head to drink the warm liquid from the bowl. The Mustang flinched at first, but slowly it began to drink, its throat working with each swallow. Blaze's nostrils flared, its breathing deepening as the warmth spread through its body. "Good," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "You've got a lot of spirit left in you." The days that followed were slow and painstaking. Elias worked tirelessly to tend to Blaze's wounds, using the herbs and potions he had gathered over the years to treat the Mustang's battered body. The animal grew stronger with each passing day, its coat beginning to regain its former luster, and its eyes losing the dullness that had once clouded them. Despite his rough exterior, Elias was a compassionate man. His own life had been shaped by hardship and isolation, but something about Blaze's will to survive resonated deeply with him. Over the course of the week, Elias and the Mustang formed a quiet bond, one that neither could explain, but both understood. Blaze, though still weak, started to show signs of improvement. It began to stand on its own, its legs trembling at first, but growing steadier each time. Elias would lead Blaze outside, allowing the horse to graze in the clearing near the cabin. Every morning, Elias would check on Blaze, watching with a growing sense of pride as the Mustang regained its strength. But the wilderness, as always, was never far away. The wolves still lurked in the forest, and their howls would send shivers down Elias's spine each night. Though Blaze was growing stronger, the pack had not forgotten the weakened horse they had once circled. Elias kept a rifle by the door, ever vigilant, knowing that the danger was far from over. As the days turned into weeks, the connection between Elias and Blaze deepened. The Mustang's once feeble body had now regained much of its strength, and though the scars of its ordeal were still visible, the fire in its eyes had returned. The wild spirit of Blaze, who had once roamed freely across the vast plains, now felt stronger, more determined. And Elias, too, found himself growing more attached to the horse than he had ever anticipated. The bond between them was not one of master and animal, but of two survivors who had been through their own personal battles and come out the other side. They had found a kind of quiet understanding. Each had saved the other, and in doing so, they had forged an unspoken pact. But the peace was fragile. The howls of the wolves never stopped. Every night, their eerie calls echoed through the forest, a constant reminder that danger was never far away. Elias remained on high alert, keeping the rifle by his side and always ensuring Blaze was safe inside the cabin at night. But something was different now. Blaze, despite his tender recovery, had a new look in his eyes. A spark of defiance had returned, and he was no longer the frightened creature who had once been tied to a tree, left to die. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in hues of gold and purple, Elias felt an unease in the air. He stood by the window of his cabin, watching Blaze graze peacefully in the clearing. The wind had shifted, and there was a subtle, tense feeling that ran through the trees, the kind Elias had learned to recognize after years of living alone in the wilderness. Something was coming. Elias turned and grabbed his rifle, the familiar weight of it reassuring in his hands. He stepped outside, scanning the tree line with sharp, trained eyes. A low growl reached his ears, and his heart skipped a beat. He knew that sound. He had heard it too many times before. The wolves had returned. At first, it was just a flicker of movement among the trees, glowing eyes, shadows weaving through the underbrush. Then, as the darkness grew deeper, the pack emerged fully. They were sleek and dangerous, their bodies low to the ground, moving in perfect unison. The leader, a massive black wolf with eyes that gleamed like shards of ice, stepped forward, its growl vibrating through the air. Blaze's ears pricked up and his muscles tensed. Elias felt the horse's gaze on him, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. There was an unspoken communication between them. Blaze knew that Elias would protect him, and Elias knew that the Mustang was no longer the helpless creature it once had been. It was a survivor, just like him. The wolves circled, their growls becoming more pronounced, their patience evident. The scent of the horse was in the air, and they would not back down easily. Elias' finger tightened on the rifle's trigger. He couldn't let them take Blaze. But just as the wolves lunged, something unexpected happened. With a sudden burst of energy, Blaze reared up on his hind legs, striking the air with his powerful hooves. The wolves hesitated, taken aback by the Mustang's sudden ferocity. Blaze, his coat now gleaming in the moonlight, launched himself into the fray. His hooves thudded against the ground, his movements fluid and swift as he lashed out at the wolves, driving them back one by one. Elias fired a warning shot into the air, scattering the pack for a moment. The wolves hesitated, unsure whether to retreat or continue their attack. The leader growled low, but it was clear that Blaze was no longer the weak animal they had once circled. The Mustang, powered by adrenaline and raw instinct, was fighting for his life, and for Elias as well. The wolves, sensing the challenge ahead, began to retreat. One by one, they melted into the shadows of the forest, their eyes gleaming but their retreat swift. Blaze stood in the clearing, chest heaving, his sides dotted with the scars of the encounter, his eyes locked onto Elias. And for the first time, Elias saw not just a survivor, but a fighter. "You did it," Elias said, his voice full of admiration. He walked toward Blaze, who stood tall, his body trembling but his spirit unbroken. The Mustang snorted, tossing his head as if to say, "I knew I could." Elias reached out, placing a hand on Blaze's neck. "I should have known better than to doubt you," he whispered. "We're not done yet. We'll face whatever comes together." As the moon rose high in the sky, Elias and Blaze stood side by side, victorious but vigilant. The wilderness had tested them both, but together they had proven that they were stronger than any force it could throw at them. The stillness that followed the wolves' retreat was almost surreal. The night air seemed to settle, as if the wilderness itself had exhaled in relief. Elias and Blaze stood in the clearing, their bond stronger than ever, their resolve unwavering. The wild energy of the Mustang had proven itself to be a force to be reckoned with, and Elias knew that together they could survive anything. But the peace was only temporary. The next morning, as dawn's first light filtered through the trees, a feeling of unease settled over Elias. Blaze was grazing near the cabin, his dark eyes flicking toward every rustle in the trees. Elias instinctively reached for his rifle, his fingers tightening around the cold metal. The wilderness had a way of testing those who lived in it, and Elias had long learned to trust his instincts. A distant sound reached his ears, hooves steadily growing louder. At first, it was a faint echo, but soon it became clear. Someone was approaching. Elias's heart tightened in his chest. He knew the sound of hooves too well. It wasn't the wolves this time. 3 figures emerged from the trees, mounted on horses, their silhouettes cutting through the haze of morning mist. The leader was tall, with a broad build and a weathered face, his eyes cold and calculating. The other 2 men flanked him, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, their hands resting lightly on the reins of their horses. Elias didn't hesitate. He stood his ground, positioning himself between the strangers and Blaze, who instinctively backed up, his ears flicking nervously. The air seemed to crackle with tension, the standoff poised to escalate at any moment. "This is private land," Elias called out, his voice steady but firm. "You've got no business here." The tall man on the horse chuckled darkly, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. "That horse belongs to us," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Took off during a storm a while back. We've been looking for him ever since." Elias's jaw tightened, his grip on the rifle unwavering. That horse was left for dead, tied to a tree like trash. Doesn't sound like the kind of care a real owner would give. The tall man's face darkened, his eyes narrowing. "Doesn't matter how you found him," he sneered. "He's ours, and we're taking him back." Elias's blood boiled. This wasn't just about the Mustang anymore. It was about justice. It was about standing up for what was right. He raised the rifle, aiming it squarely at the man's chest. "You're not taking him anywhere," Elias said, his voice steady with resolve. For a moment there was nothing but silence, thick and heavy. The 2 men flanking the leader shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, their hands hovering near their own weapons. Blaze stood beside Elias, his muscles tense, his eyes locked on the approaching threat. The Mustang wasn't backing down either. The tall man let out a low chuckle, his voice dripping with mockery. "You've got guts, old man," he said, "but you're outnumbered. You really think you can stop us?" Elias didn't flinch. He had faced danger before, whether it was wild animals or brutal storms, but this felt different. These men weren't just a threat to Blaze. They were a threat to everything Elias had worked for in his years of solitude. They were a threat to the life he had fought so hard to carve out in the wilderness. As the man moved his hand toward his weapon, Elias made a decision. He dropped the rope that had tethered Blaze to the cabin and took a step back. "Go, Blaze," Elias commanded, his voice calm but forceful. "Take them on." For a brief moment, Blaze hesitated, his eyes flicking between the men and Elias. Then, with a defiant snort, the Mustang reared up on his hind legs, his hooves striking the air with a resounding crack. The men were taken aback, but before they could react, Blaze charged forward, his powerful body cutting through the air like a bullet. The leader barely had time to draw his revolver before Blaze was upon him, his hooves thundering against the ground. The Mustang's wild energy was unstoppable. He struck at the men with swift, precise movements, driving them back in a flurry of hooves and growls. The horses panicked, bolting into the trees as their riders struggled to regain control. Elias fired a warning shot into the air, and the men scattered, retreating into the forest with curses on their lips. Blaze stood in the clearing, his sides heaving, his eyes blazing with the triumph of victory. "Well done, boy," Elias said, his voice filled with admiration. "You faced them down." Blaze snorted, tossing his head as if to say, "I knew all along that I could." The two of them stood there for a moment, the forest quiet once more. The threat had passed, for now. But Elias knew that this wasn't over. The men would be back. They wouldn't give up so easily. The forest was quiet once again, but Elias's sense of unease had not lifted. Though the men had retreated, their words lingered in the air, a chilling reminder that they would return. Elias had seen too many battles in the wilderness to think this would be the last of them. The men would come back, but next time they would be prepared. Elias knew he had to take action. Blaze had proven himself a fighter, but Elias wasn't naive. The men who had come for him were dangerous, and they wouldn't rest until they had the Mustang. He had no intention of letting that happen. The days passed slowly, each one filled with tension. Elias worked hard to fortify his cabin. He reinforced the doors and windows, setting traps around the perimeter, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Blaze, now stronger than ever, stood by his side. The Mustang had become more than just a companion. He was a partner in survival. The bond between them had only deepened since the wolves' attack. Together, they were ready for whatever the wilderness or the men had to throw at them. One evening, as the sun sank beneath the horizon, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of danger. Blaze stood outside, grazing near the edge of the clearing, his ears flicking at every sound. Elias stood by the cabin, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the tree line. He didn't have to wait long. The unmistakable sound of hooves echoed through the forest, growing louder with each passing moment. Elias felt a cold chill run down his spine. He turned toward Blaze, who had raised his head, nostrils flaring. The Mustang knew. "They're back," Elias muttered under his breath. As if on cue, 4 figures emerged from the shadows, mounted on horses and armed for battle. The leader, the same tall man who had confronted Elias before, dismounted with purpose, a shotgun gleaming in his hands. His eyes were hard, his jaw set. This time, he wasn't taking any chances. "We're not leaving without that horse," the man called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. Elias didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his rifle steady in his hands. "You think you can just take him from me?" Elias asked, his voice calm, but filled with a quiet fury. "That horse is mine. You abandoned him, left him to die. He's not yours anymore." The tall man's expression hardened. "You've got guts, old man," he sneered, "but you're outnumbered. 4 of us and 1 of you. You really think you can stop us?" Elias didn't flinch. He knew what he had to do. With a single motion, he lifted his rifle and aimed it at the leader. "I don't care how many of you there are," he said, his voice unwavering. "You won't take Blaze." The men paused, their hands hovering near their weapons. For a long moment the forest stood still. Elias could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. This was it, the final standoff. The leader raised his shotgun, aiming it directly at Elias. "Last chance, old man," he growled. "Hand over the horse and maybe we'll let you live." Elias's finger tightened on the rifle's trigger, but just as he was about to fire, the sound of a snare trap snapping echoed through the clearing. One of the men's horses had stepped into a trap Elias had set earlier, and the animal reared up, throwing its rider to the ground. The man scrambled to his feet, cursing, but Elias didn't waste the opportunity. He took a step back, using the cabin as cover, his rifle trained on the remaining men. "Leave now, and no one else gets hurt," Elias called out. "But if you step 1 foot closer, I won't hesitate." The leader's face twisted with rage, but he seemed to realize Elias wasn't bluffing. He barked orders to his men, signaling them to advance. But as they moved forward, Blaze, sensing the danger, stepped forward and reared up once again, his hooves striking the air with terrifying force. In an instant, the Mustang was charging at the men, his powerful legs carrying him with unmatched speed. The men tried to react, but Blaze was unstoppable. His hooves pounded against the ground, sending vibrations through the forest floor as he lunged toward the leader. The man tried to draw his weapon, but before he could fire, Blaze knocked the shotgun from his hands with a swift kick. The leader stumbled back, his eyes wide with fear as the Mustang towered over him. The rest of the men hesitated, unsure how to react to the ferocity of Blaze's attack. Elias didn't wait for them to regroup. He fired a shot, hitting one of the men in the leg. The man screamed in pain, falling to the ground as his horse bolted into the trees. The remaining attackers, shaken by Blaze's wild energy and Elias' precise shooting, retreated into the forest, disappearing as quickly as they had come. Elias lowered his rifle, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He looked at Blaze, who stood tall in the clearing, his sides heaving but his spirit unbroken. "You did it, boy," Elias said, his voice filled with admiration. "You showed them what you're made of." Blaze snorted, tossing his head as if to say, "I knew all along how this would end." The men were gone, and Elias knew they wouldn't be back. The forest had spoken. Justice had been served. The forest had returned to its usual rhythm. The wind whispered through the trees. The distant hoot of an owl echoed in the night, and Blaze grazed peacefully near the cabin, his chestnut coat gleaming in the soft light of the rising moon. Elias leaned against the cabin's wooden frame, his rifle resting by his side. His eyes, though tired, shone with a quiet pride. Together they had faced the wolves, the men, and the wilderness itself, and together they had emerged victorious. For the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. The threats that had loomed over them had been dealt with, and now Elias could breathe easier. The men who had tried to take Blaze had been defeated, their attempts thwarted by the Mustang's strength and Elias's determination. The wilderness, as harsh as it was, had taught them both lessons of survival, resilience, and loyalty. Elias knew, however, that this peace was only temporary. The wilderness was never truly free of danger, but with Blaze by his side, he felt ready for whatever lay ahead. They had formed an unbreakable bond, a bond forged through struggle and survival, a bond that no one, not even the harshest forces of nature or the most ruthless men, could break. As the days passed, Blaze grew stronger. His once wounded body was now healed, his movements fluid and confident. He was no longer the weak creature tied to a tree, waiting for death. He was a proud Mustang again, a symbol of strength and defiance. And Elias, in turn, had found a companion he never thought he would have. Blaze had become more than just a horse. He had become a partner, a friend, a source of hope. One morning, as the sun began to rise, casting golden rays over the forest, Elias stood by the edge of the clearing, watching Blaze graze. The Mustang's dark eyes met his, and for a moment there was a quiet understanding between them. Blaze had been through hell, but he had come out stronger, a true survivor, and now it was time for him to be free. Elias walked toward Blaze, his hand resting gently on the horse's neck. "You've earned it, boy," Elias said softly, his voice filled with both pride and sadness. "Go on now, run free." For a long moment, Blaze stood still, as if contemplating the words. Then, with a powerful leap, the Mustang took off, his hooves pounding against the earth as he disappeared into the forest. Elias watched him go, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. The Mustang was free, just as he was meant to be. The clearing felt emptier now, but Elias knew it wasn't the same as before. Blaze's presence had left its mark. It had reminded him that even in the deepest solitude, there was always the possibility of connection, of loyalty, of hope. As the weeks turned into months, Elias continued his life in the cabin, but something had changed. The wilderness no longer felt as lonely as it once had. Blaze was out there, somewhere in the wild, running free as he had always been meant to. And every so often, Elias would catch a glimpse of a chestnut figure moving through the trees, a reminder that the Mustang was still out there, living the life he deserved. Elias often found himself smiling at the thought. He had given Blaze a chance to survive, to fight back against the world that had once abandoned him. And in doing so, he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing: hope. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the forest. Elias leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the tree line, waiting for a glimpse of Blaze. Though the Mustang no longer lived in the clearing, his spirit would always be with Elias. Together, they had faced the wilderness, and together they had proven that no matter how cruel or unforgiving life may be, there was always room for resilience, for survival, and for a bond that could never be broken. And in that moment, Elias knew one thing for certain: freedom is not just about survival, it's about reclaiming what was meant to be yours and never letting go.